So this evening, in search of the Yeti, are we going to get an answer, or is it?
Absolutely.
Is it worth hanging around? Yeah. So we have on nearest the screen Andrew Benfield, who has a long history in the region, very accomplished polyglot, musician, writer, researcher, works in human development. And then Richard Horsey, who works for the International Crisis Group in his day job, and is extremely well known in journalistic circles because he is the go-to person for quotes on the political situation in Burma. So when you want to learn about abominable generals, you ring up Richard Horsey, and he provides the most amazing quotes at exactly the right moment in time. Very, very useful guy. Right, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dominic. Yeah, it is a bit strange to be sitting here talking about this subject. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the audience, but I've sat here many times over the last 20 years speaking on different aspects of the situation in Myanmar, but this is really a first for me to be speaking on the Yeti. You may be wondering how this all came about and what I'm doing here, and so over to Andy to explain, because he's responsible for it.
Guilty. I'll start by saying I'm not actually some conspiracy nut. I had a fairly normal upbringing. I did come across the Yeti. I read, like probably many of you, Tintin or Tintin for French speakers in Tibet. I saw the Scooby-Doo episodes. But I wasn't particularly interested, and I certainly didn't think it was a real thing. You know, this was clearly fantasy. So what happened? Well, I got a job with the European Union, and I ended up working in Delhi, in India, covering South Asia. And one day, I'm doing some reading on the region, and someone gave me this book. And it's called The Sherpa and the Snowman, and it's about a 1950s British expedition sponsored by the Daily Mail newspaper to look for the Yeti. So I thought this would be a fun read, something light, great. So I'm reading through it. They don't find a Yeti, no surprise there. But there's lots of consistent local stories about this creature. And what was striking was the conclusion seemed to be, if the foreigners haven't seen it, it doesn't exist. And I'm working in international development at the time, and it struck a nerve with me, this thing of like not listening to local voices enough. You know, the foreigners know best, no, we can just disregard that. So I start doing some more research, and I turn up some interesting and pretty surprising stuff. This is one of my favorites on the screen there. This is a memo from the US Embassy in Kathmandu in 1959 about the Yeti, official embassy memo. With point 2, making clear that, quote, it must not be killed or shot at except in an emergency arising out of self-defense. So, yeah, good foreign policy advice there. And the surprises didn't end there. I found out Pliny the Elder had been writing about the Yeti way back. Alexander the Great was looking for one. This chap, British mountaineer Eric Shipton, he was not looking for one, but in 1951, he's climbing on a glacier near Everest, and he sees something and takes a photo of it, which makes the Yeti, or what was then dubbed by the media the abominable snowman, go viral. And that's this photograph. It was a series of prints in the snow. What finally tipped me over the edge was a video clip I saw of a gentleman who's asked, do you think there could still be any large undiscovered creatures in the world today?
I actually believe that there is a real possibility that there might be something in the abominable snowman mystery.
So that is Sir David Attenborough, I would say, the world's greatest naturalist. And if he believes it, I think I can basically leave it there, and I'd drop the mic if I could, yeah.
Maybe. Let's see. But also, expeditions to search for the Yeti weren't always what they seemed. Peak Yeti was in the 1950s, in the wake of that Shipton photo that Andy showed you just now. And this set off a wave of interest in the Yeti. And that meant that saying you were going to look for it was a surefire way to get funding for your expedition. So take, for example, Sir Edmund Hillary's 1960 so-called Silver Hut Yeti expedition. That's the Silver Hut in the photo there. He pitched it as a search for the Yeti, got a lot of funding, but what he actually spent his time doing was studying the effects of high altitude on human physiology inside that hut. And looking for Yetis was also a great way to go sniffing around sensitive border areas. If you wanted to check out Chinese rocket launchers in Tibet, say. And there are stories of the CIA being behind some Yeti expeditions because it gave them cover for intelligence gathering activities. One of the members, actually, of the 1954 Daily Mail expedition Andy read this book about was actually a British spy who worked under Ian Fleming in World War II and was one of the inspirations for Fleming's most famous characters, James Bond. And then cryptozoology always attracts its share of weirdos and nutters. Not us, no. So we have the Nazis at one point out looking for the Yeti. This sounds like the corny plot from an Indiana Jones movie, but it's true. And they were doing it because, get this, they thought the Yeti might be the progenitor of the Aryan race. So... So it's safe to say I started out 100% skeptical. But when Andy proposed that we go to look for the Yeti in northeast India, I thought, well, you know, it could be a fun way to go to some really interesting places, meet some interesting people. I didn't pay too much attention to the Yeti aspect of it. So I went along as expedition skeptic. And as the responsible accompanying adult that Andy occasionally requires. And we headed up to one of the most remote parts of India, Arunachal Pradesh, up near the Bhutanese and Tibetan borders. Now, the roads up there are incredibly rough. And so Andy thought that a couple of old Indian motorcycles would be the perfect way to get around up there. The only small snag was I'd never really ridden a proper motorbike, so I had to get on a pretty steep learning curve as well as pretty steep actual curves. Now, Andy will no doubt want me to mention at this point the 3 small crashes that I had on the first day, but they were very small, and after that, it was plain sailing, pretty much. And, you know, we biked and hiked all over the mountains of Arunachal Pradesh. There was one incident where we had to be rescued from a mountain pass by the Indian Army, but that was actually Andy's fault, not mine. Overall, it was a fantastic...
Move it along.
Yes. So it was a fantastic couple of weeks, really great trip. Of course, we didn't see any Yetis.
So we didn't see any Yetis, but we got a number of remarkable stories about something called a grepu. This lady's father was famous for having killed one in the 1950s. This couple told us how one night around the campfire out in the mountains, one had savaged their dog. And then this nomad took us up to this memorial site where someone had been killed, and they claim that the Yeti was the culprit. And there were a lot more stories like this. And I think, you know, it's fair to say we were both kind of a bit taken aback at the amount of stories we heard.
It was unexpected. But what people told us was that Yeti Central was actually just across the border in northern Myanmar, the far north of Myanmar. And that was handy because we were both living and working in Yangon at the time. This was before the coup. But Yangon is still an incredibly long way from the Myanmar Himalayas. And the roads up there are really something else. I decided at this point that it was a case of 2 wheels bad, 4 wheels good.
Is that a George Orwell joke?
Yep. And so we managed to procure a 50-year-old Land Rover for the trip. Now, I don't know if any of you have driven old Land Rovers, but this was a classic example of the genre. It turned out that her steering, her gears, the single functioning windscreen wiper, the exhaust, basically everything was incredibly loose. So Andy immediately christened her Lucy. And so Many breakdowns and a long, tough slog up through the jungle. Later, we eventually reached the stunning Burmese Himalayas. But again, I'm afraid it was Richard 1, Andy 0, with absolutely no Yeti sightings.
We didn't see a Yeti, but we met a lot of people who'd seen something that they called a Nye Bibi. So, for example, this gentleman from the Lisu community said he'd shot one with the very bow you can see on his shoulder there. This woman said she'd been surprised by a shaggy bipedal beast when out foraging in the forest one day. And then we run into 2 other foreigners at our guest house, and we haven't seen any other foreigners up there. It's a fairly remote area. And we find out they're ex-British Army mountaineers. So we're like, we're not going to tell them what we're doing. You know, these guys are going to, at best, ridicule us. And, you know, it's... But we did, and we were sitting around the fire one night, and they didn't ridicule us. They responded deadly seriously, because they'd seen something, they said, a few years ago when climbing near Everest. It was in the distance. They just couldn't work out what it was. It looked like some kind of ape. They were completely mystified. And the Sherpas that were with them said, you've just seen a Yeti. So, yeah, that was quite something. Huh?
We also heard some slightly more bizarre stories of Yetis kidnapping people and tying them up or appearing out of clouds. One where the Yeti was playing the flute, I recall.
I mean, that one was definitely a bit dodgy, yeah. But yeah, there's definitely some myth and folklore around a lot of these stories. But you have to remember that myth and folklore often grow up around very rare but yet real creatures. So a lot of communities in the Himalayas will tell you things like the snow leopard can fly. Now, I don't believe the snow leopard can fly, but I believe the snow leopard exists. And what was remarkable was that the more credible stories were giving this consistent description of a creature. Consistent not only across the people we met in northern Myanmar, but also with those we've met in India. But I'm sorry to disappoint you, it was not of a big, white, shaggy snow monster. Something bipedal, yes, orangey brown hair, a kind of conical head, apparently very stinky. That was a really consistent theme. This is a painting from a monastery wall in Nepal of a couple of Yetis. The interesting thing is, we now know there used to be a big ape in the region from fossil evidence. It was called Gigantopithecus. And the super interesting thing is, its closest living relative is the orangutan. And when we meet people and ask them about their stories, I mean, we try to be a bit scientific about it, and we show them photos of different creatures, like a bear, a gorilla, Richard, an orangutan, and the 2 things they normally point out are the gorilla and the orangutan as most similar to what they saw. So, you know, we've kind of, outside the region and in the West, we've got the description kind of wrong. Also, people are very biased, I found out, to stories from people like Richard and I, basically middle-aged white men. So they'll tell you the first recorded Yeti sighting was from this chap, and that's B.H. Hodgson, who was the British resident, so the ambassador in Nepal in the 19th century. And he published an account in the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1832. Now, that's not true at all. The local accounts go back centuries. It is often more of an oral tradition, but you can find writings about the Yeti in old Buddhist texts, for example. You can find it represented in old songs, in ceremonial temple dances, and also in old pictures. And their attitude to this creature is very different too. We know it's there, we don't need to prove it. It's something to be feared and revered. It also has a kind of important cultural role, surprisingly enough. And, you know, that is very different from the typical Western attitude over the years, which is we're going to shoot this thing, stuff it, you know, get it back to the British Museum, do a talk at the Royal Geographical Society and make a name for ourselves. You're very, very kind of ego-driven. So, yeah, there's a real difference in approach there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That last one was a great movie, by the way. But so where did this distorted image of the abominable snowman come from? I mean, this is part of a sensationalization of the Yeti by the West. It started with the name, Abominable Snowman, which is an intentional mistranslation from Tibetan by a British journalist in the 1920s because he thought it would sound more fearsome. As for the white shaggy fur, we have American TV network NBC to thank for that. They created it for their Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer animated TV special for Christmas 1964. Here it is, and Rudolph's just down there, I think. And it's been shown on American TV apparently every year since. It's the longest running TV special in the US. And that misleading image stuck. And it became the default characterization of the Yeti outside the region. And it still is, as you can see from recent movies. And that's kind of condemned it to the fantasy basket, along with the unicorn or the phoenix. Now, after the Burma trip, COVID unfortunately stopped play until November 2021. And we then decided to head to the Solokhumbu region of Everest. We thought we'd remove the dodgy vehicles entirely this time and just hike on foot. There's actually no roads up there anyway. So Andy flew up, but then I had to cancel at the last minute because of new COVID travel restrictions in Australia. But we kept calm, carried on, and like everyone else, jumped on Zoom. So for the next month or so, I provided invaluable desktop research and advice while Andy did all the lead work. And we also took a bit of guidance from the 1950s snowman expedition on what areas to focus on and where the kind of hotspots, alleged hotspots might be.
So left to my own devices, I was fairly efficient, I think, and it did work quite well. Whenever I got a connection, I was having a Zoom with Richard. He was updating me on what he'd found, digging through the archives. And together, we managed to track down the survivor of one of the most famous Yeti attacks. And this happened in 1974. This lady's name is Lakpadoma Sherpa. The attack was, or the report of the attack was seen as so credible that it was actually on the international news wires. It was in the Sunday Times in the UK at the time. And one of the reasons for that was not only that she was sadly injured and thrown into a river in the attack, but also that 5 of her yaks were killed with such kind of strength and savagery that no one could really explain what could have done this. And amazingly, all these years later, she's actually still up there herding yaks near Everest. Also popped into some monasteries in the region to look at alleged Yeti relics. This is a purported scalp that was actually taken around the world by Sir Edmund Hillary and tested back in the day.
It's goat.
It did turn out to be goat, but there's no need to tell the ladies and gentlemen that now. And then I got a bit distracted because the responsible adult wasn't there. And a famous Nepali mountaineer whispered to me that there were rumors of nomads wearing Yeti hair necklaces. And I mean, even for me, that was a bit like, wow, that is far out. But not in Solokhumbu near Everest. It was actually in the kingdom of Mustang, which is another part of Nepal. Quite tricky to get to, both geographically and also to get the permits. But eventually managed, and with a bit of luck and some connections we managed to track down the nomads near the Tibetan border and found out that the story was in fact true. But then Omicron, remember that, stopped play, so I had to cut things short and get back home.
And then, thanks to Andy, this happened.
What about a quest for the Yeti? Is our next speaker.
So my hopes of keeping my involvement in this whole Yeti caper under wraps and my professional reputation somehow intact were suddenly shot to pieces. You see, Andy had on a whim applied to give a talk at the Royal Geographical Society in London on the Yeti. And amazingly, they said yes. Now, you have to remember that this is the venue where Darwin previewed his theory of evolution, where Hillary reported on summiting Everest, where Shackleton lectured on his Antarctica explorations. And now we have Horsey and Benfield on the Yeti. But people were actually surprisingly receptive, and we didn't get ridiculed.
And I mean, this is the issue, and I mean, it's the same here this evening. The Yeti as a real creature has become a toxic brand, right? It is an object of ridicule. So I tend to ask people not, do you believe in the Yeti, but do you believe there could be undiscovered species still out there? To which the answer should certainly be yes. I mean, we are discovering new species regularly. Some of those are mammals, some of those are fairly big mammals, monkeys, they're deer. And what's interesting is that people in the areas where they're discovered, often quite remote, have been hunting and eating them for years in many cases. And then the outsiders come in and say, oh, we've discovered this new thing. And those outsiders often have to eat their own words because more often than not, there have been some reports about these creatures that have been dismissed as this is mythology, this is local people, strange beliefs, they don't really know what they're talking about. That happened with the hippo back in the day, ridiculed, it was a joke. The giraffe, the rhino, it happened with the gorilla. People only believed in the gorilla when a German soldier shot one and sent it in a crate to the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So,
which is not what we're planning to do, should we ever meet one, by the way.
Just to be very, very clear. And there's also a precedent for creatures we thought were extinct to suddenly show up. The coelacanth fish, they thought it had been extinct for, I think, 60 million years, and then a South African fisherman dredges one up in his net one day and finds it, alive and well. I guess he didn't throw it back, so it probably is no longer alive and well, but yeah.
But, to be honest, there's a big difference between finding a rare fish, the ocean is a big place, and most of those mammals that have been discovered, new mammal species, they're pretty closely related to kinds of mammals we know about. So, I mean, the Yeti is something quite different from that. So what is it that people who believe in the Yeti think it might actually be? Well, basically, there are three theories. The first is that it's some kind of bear. Maybe it's a new species or subspecies that's more prone to walking on its hind legs, slightly different coloring. And it's very likely that quite a lot of Yeti sightings are actually misidentifications of bears. But probably not all of them, because people who live in these high mountain areas, they interact with bears regularly. They know what bears look like. The second possibility is that it's a relic hominin. Now, for the record, I find this extraordinarily far-fetched. But some people point out that we're actually discovering fossil evidence of new hominins, such as Homo denisova in Russia, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, that survived until much more recently than we thought before. And we also now know that we lived alongside Neanderthals much longer than we'd realized, so long that we interbred, which is why if you're of European or Asian descent, it's very likely that 1 to 2% of your genes are Neanderthal derived.
And there's also that recent story that there's a gene Tibetans and Sherpas have that no other Homo sapiens have, which helps you survive at high altitude. Where did they then find that gene? In Denisovan DNA. So that means they had it, their forefathers and foremothers had interbred at some point. So,
yeah, I mean, it's one thing to say there were these other hominins that lived until, human cultural memory might have started to exist. It's another to suggest that they're walking around in a valley somewhere today. But, all of this did lead the editor of the scientific journal Nature to say in 2004 that tales of human-like creatures surviving in remote locations were definitely worthy of investigation. So, as I say, pretty far-fetched, but perhaps not completely crazy. And option 3 is that it's some kind of ape. So in 1935, a German paleontologist was in Hong Kong poking around some old traditional Chinese medicine shops, and he found these giant teeth in a box marked dragon's teeth. Now, being slightly more skeptical than Andy, he didn't immediately declare that he'd discovered evidence of dragons. He took them away and studied them and found that they came from a giant ape that was christened Gigantopithecus. Now, there's very few scraps of fossil evidence of this creature, a few teeth and fragments of jawbone, but the morphological evidence suggests that its closest living relative is the orangutan, and that Gigantopithecus roamed all over Asia until the beginning of the last ice age, so maybe 100,000 years ago. This is also Attenborough's theory, by the way, that the Yeti could be related to Gigantopithecus. And it's interesting that, as Andy said before, when we show people pictures who say they've seen the Yeti, pictures of different creatures, it's the orangutan, sometimes the gorilla, that they pick out and say, yeah, it was like that.
But whatever it is, we're not actually really planning or trying to see one. So, why is that? I'm sure you've seen these documentaries on TV with a heavy American voiceover where they go up with infrared cameras and look for it. Our theory is that if people living up there a lifetime, it's very rare for them to see it once, and it's getting rarer. What chance are we going to have? So instead we focus on stories from people, but hoping that one of those will eventually lead to some physical evidence we can get tested, so hair, bone, scat. So stories from who? We speak to hunters, nomads, yak herders, monks and nuns who meditate in remote caves, soldiers who patrol remote border areas. Also some more unusual people. We interviewed the Dalai Lama's oracle, for example.
He was quite an interview, that one.
Interesting chap. A Nepali princess, both believers. But that's not to say we, even I, believe everything we hear. There is definitely some myth and folklore in there. There can also be other agendas. There was the gentleman in Burma who told us that every night a Yeti indeed visits him, comes to his hut, in fact, after his wife has gone to bed. She was there at the time when he was telling us, and steals all the alcohol. And even I thought maybe something else could be going on there. But for every story like that, there's another credible one with consistent descriptions. When you've heard from all these people and more, it's hard to conclude they're all fantasists, especially because when we're up there, we're not survival experts. We're dependent on these people very often and their knowledge of flora and fauna, of geography and weather to keep us alive. So you really trust them implicitly. And so it's like you're saying, I trust you on all this stuff, but on this Yeti business, no, you must be mad. But that kind of dismissal is what a lot of outsiders do. And a Sherpa gentleman said to me, yeah, well, the thing is there, you see, you're suffering from the low altitude sickness. I said, what? What's that? And he said, well, high altitude sickness, when, you have a negative physical effect from being high up. And he said, low altitude sickness is you people who spend a lot of time in the lowlands and the cities. You end up with a mental deficiency. That you think everything's on Wikipedia. There can't possibly be anything you don't know, and you've got a severe case of low-altitude sickness. Well, fair enough.
Very good. Now, if I thought talking about the Yeti at the Royal Geographical Society might be bad for my professional reputation, talking about it on the BBC was really going to nail the lid on the coffin. So we got contacted by the Beeb, who proposed making a podcast about our adventures. Andy, of course, immediately said yes. So we had all the material from our trips to India and Myanmar and Nepal, but they felt we needed one more. So they sent us off to Bhutan. We traveled right across the country. We got to see the remarkable natural beauty of the place and really impressive efforts by the government to conserve the natural environment as well as the traditional Bhutanese culture. And I think the definite highlight was the far east of the country, where you have the Sakteng Wildlife Sanctuary. And this is a wildlife sanctuary that was set up by the Bhutanese government with the express purpose of protecting the natural habitat of the Yeti. Wow.
I think that's the first time a government actually putting it into law basically that the Yeti exists. But before we got out there to the Yeti sanctuary, we hit gold in Thimphu, in the capital. We met a young entrepreneur. He was a very smart guy, very down to earth, I would say. He'd been out off-road motorcycling in a remote area of Bhutan, and he had come across this. This is actually a photo of his phone, which is why it's at the funny angle. But there are apparently a series of these footprints. And, you know, when he talked about it, you could see he was really shaken by this. Like, he didn't have an explanation for it. He took the photos, then got out of there, you know, ASAP. But they later spoke to some monks at a remote monastery in the area who said, yeah, there are migui, which is the Bhutanese word for yeti, hanging around here. So it was a very strong start for Benfield. I was very happy with that. But then, unfortunately, along came this man. He's actually a very nice chap, Ranger Pema. So he's with the Wildlife Service.
One of the most experienced rangers in Bhutan.
One of the most experienced rangers in Bhutan. So he should have had lots of Yeti stories and been, you know, very much Team Benfield. But no, he was, you know, point blank, like, no, not seeing anything like that. You know, it sounds pretty unlikely to me. So I was pretty crestfallen. And then we met a Bhutanese scientist, Tashi, who'd done wildlife surveys across the countries where they're putting out these camera traps to record wildlife. So again, we were like, you know, surely something's cropped up. And he memorably said, as a Bhutanese, I would love to believe in the Yeti, but as a scientist, I find it hard to. So yeah, that wasn't such good news. What was great news was meeting Kunsang Choden. She is one of Bhutan's foremost national treasures. She's an author, a cultural historian, a lot else beside. And she took us into the significance of the Yeti for Bhutanese and many other people in the region, its environmental and social role. So, for example, they'll tell you if you go and do something bad in the natural world, if you go and pollute the forest or the rivers, it's the Yeti. It's the Yeti that will come and get you. The Yeti is seen as a guardian. And for some groups, it's also part of their origin story, that it's the Yeti that actually brought them to Bhutan. So that was pretty fascinating. And she's written a book called Bhutanese Tales of the Yeti, which collects a lot of stories together. She's written another book called Monk Chasing Monkey, which is about the Buddhist concept of the monkey mind, right? That our minds are like a monkey jumping through a tree. We can never settle on one thing. We're always going for something else. Once we get it, we drop it, we run off to the next shiny thing. And she said with a twinkle in her eye, like, you know, Richard, Andrew, isn't that a bit what you're doing? And I mean, if you find this thing, then what? You know, you'll just drop it and you'll be off looking for something else. So what was it she said? She said you're like monkey mind looking for monkey man. Yeah, which was quite apt. So she had a good point, but I felt I had a job to do and I wasn't doing it. Which, you know, I'd promised the BBC in Bhutan we're going to get lots of stories, you know, and I don't want like Jonathan Head coming around when I get back and saying what happened. So I just wasn't getting it done. So I was getting quite stressed by this point. And then we got to the Far East, to the Yeti Sanctuary, and then the going got pretty tough. It was long trek. You can see on that day it was 23 kilometers, 30,000 steps, high altitude. So I started falling apart a little bit. I mean, you know, you'd think it would be Richard, but no, it was me. And I ended up just getting very sick and having to be kind of evacuated down to the nearest town. And at that point, you know, yes, I was disappointed, but there was almost a catharsis as well of like, you know, maybe Kunsang Choden had something. It's more about the journey. I should just, you know, kind of, I should let this go now. But it was not to be, because when I was laid up, Richard went a bit rogue.
Well, I mean, so with Andy relaxing in comfort with his parasite, I was left to finish the expedition alone. This was the longest and toughest trek of our whole trip, high up to remote pastures to meet a yak herder who said that he'd had an encounter with a Yeti at close quarters the year before. So I spent a night sleeping in a tent alone on this hillside in the dark, imagining all these sounds around and what could be making them. The next morning, I go to meet Manny, who's coming up in a minute, this gentleman, and he took me to the place where he'd seen this creature. It was actually on the grassy field that you can see behind him there. He'd seen it just there. He'd cowered behind that rock and waited until the creature went on its way. Now, a few things made this a particularly striking account. It was close by, so there wasn't the normal question of, oh, this is a, eyes playing tricks on you, trick of the light kind of stuff. It was very recent, so, he had very sharp memory of what had happened. And he seemed like a very genuine, down-to-earth person. He didn't seem like he was trying to spin a tale or whatever. He was also a very keen hunter and naturalist. He showed sort of very good level of knowledge of the natural world around him. And so, he said, this happened. I was terrified, and so I asked him, what did it look like? Showed him the pictures, and he picked out the gorilla immediately. Said it looked like that, same musculature, reddish brown hair. So, I've always been a skeptic throughout this, but this one really shook me, and it started to make me feel less comfortable in my skepticism. And I started to think, what's going on here? I mean, if this had been a human rights interview I was doing, I'd have been coming back saying, this guy really had credibility. I just believe what he told me. And yet he told me he just met a Yeti just past that rock there. So, it was tough.
Yeah, and you then came successfully back from that trip, and he met me in my nursing home. And, I saw his face, and I was like, oh, he's got something here. And so for me, it wasn't just, the story sounded amazing, but it was also that, Richard's always been my sounding board to make sure I'm not really losing my marbles. If he's still coming along on these trips, there's at least a chance that there's something in it. So that really quite moved me. And then I guess the mountain gods were smiling on us, because I think it was the next day, our final day in Bhutan, we actually got our hands on a piece of physical evidence that we could get tested finally. But at the same time, the journeys have still become, I think, as important as the destination. I mean, if the Yeti was to be found in Essex in the UK, where I'm from, I probably, wouldn't be out looking for it. But we get to go here. They're awesomely beautiful, the Himalayas. And their size, their height, the remoteness, it gives the topographical possibility for a creature to live mostly unseen. It also puts you in your place, puts your ego, your worries in your place, your comparisons with others. It doesn't matter what's on your business card or what you're driving, the mountains and the weather will kill you if you're not careful up there. And that means, on the positive side, that collaboration and cooperation is the name of the game, not competition. And that's a kind of refreshing thing. And we get this amazing to local culture, to people, because we're not just trekking around or paying someone to carry stuff for us. We're sitting down, having some disgusting, I must say, yak butter tea. I know you're a fan, but it's worth it. And you start talking about the Yeti, you end up talking about life, about families, about yaks, about Buddhism, whatever. So that is, that's fantastic. It's fascinating, and it's also fun. So we've got a little video clip just to try and give you a flavor of what the trips involve. So if we can run that little video. There was a waving hand. That's good. Yeah, okay. It's behind you.
So it's out now, 10 episodes. It's also been broadcast weekly on BBC Radio 4. I think the last episode just went out a week or two ago. And amazingly, it went a bit viral. 3 days after the first episode dropped, it was the most popular documentary podcast on the BBC.
Beating both Putin and COVID. I mean, Disney was a given, but Putin and COVID, yeah.
We were even reviewed in the Financial Times, of all places. They don't normally carry a lot of Yeti content.
And we were in the Daily Express as well, which, if you know British media, is a different kind of paper. But they did a nice interview with us, and we were very glad that they did print our comments about this kind of appropriation of the Yeti image, you know, in the West, and making it into this kind of fantasy snow monster. But unfortunately, their graphic designer or their art director didn't seem to actually read the article, because that was the picture that they printed in the national newspaper.
We also caused a bit of a stir on Indian Twitter. The backstory being that in 2019, the Indian Army had tweeted these Yeti footprint photographs, and the BBC had taken this less than seriously. And so Indian Twitter pointed out that having done that, the BBC has then put out its own series on the Yeti. But yeah.
It's only had 32,000 views, so I think it's fine, yes. So it's available on BBC Sounds, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts. We're also putting out, we've put out a bunch of video on particularbear.com, which is my website and my social media. Richard's so far refusing to put anything out on his, in the belief he has some vestiges of a professional reputation still to save. But you are going to answer the ladies and gentlemen's challenging questions in a minute. So thank you for listening. We hope a few of you are I hope a few of you are a lot less skeptical than when you walked in this evening. You know, there could really be something out there. Not all those people can be wrong. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, as usual, we have a microphone at the back of the room for anybody who wants to ask a question. I'd like to ask you, what next?
I mean, obviously, a podcast has limits, right? It's audio only, and although it's a great challenge to try and describe views and use audio to present a full color picture of where we went, this kind of location is just crying out for TV, right? So any TV executives in the audience, please note.
And the other thing I forgot to say, there's an 11th episode of the podcast coming out, so 10 are out, but that physical evidence we got is in the US right now in a lab today being tested. The DNA, we think they've extracted the DNA, it's now being sequenced. So in that 11th episode, we don't know what'll be in it, but it'll be the results of that and how we feel about it. So it'll either be like a really happy Andy or a really happy Richard, but not both.
And what is the physical evidence?
It is a hair.
One hair.
It is one very special hair. So it's not. We've gone a bit further actually than that, in that we had a is taxonomist. Is that the word I want? Yes. A taxonomist look at it, and they said it looked to them. It's not human. It is animal. And it looked like some kind of ape, but we've got to get DNA to be sure. So that's why we've gone
just
to
a
the
microscope
trouble.
analysis.
So yeah, on but these are guys who are professionals at identifying species by hair. So we've got some hope for it. Yeah.
And that's when? November? Or?
October 20th, the episode will be released. We can't record it until we've got the results, but we're hoping in the next 2 weeks. Yeah.
I was very interested by the fact that everybody that's looked at it says it's a orangutan or a gorilla. Yet those are both creatures that live in very warm climates. So what are we talking about? How on earth does this thing survive up there, if it exists? Doesn't it freeze to death?
I mean, I think there are a whole host of questions, right? How does it live at altitude? What does it eat? These are very large creatures. Large creatures need huge ranges and a lot of food. How many are there? You need a viable breeding population. All of these are questions that, loom large, right? It's not just, can we find one? It's how would you explain all that? And this is where, you have to be a little bit skeptical, I think. But then you have to explain all of this as well, and so yeah.
And this idea that it is living in the snows, that's very much Tintin stuff. I mean, it's it would be maybe crossing a pass, and that's where you're going to see the footprints because there's snow. But in order to get to the next valley where there's a food source or something like that,
Because in a lot of the footage there was very little snow to be seen. I mean, you were in the Himalayas.
Yeah, most of the sightings we have are not from snow areas. I mean, people say they've seen it in forests.
Right.
So yeah.
Jonathan, BBC Strikes Back.
Oh, God.
What could I do as a follow-up to that? You basically eclipsed anything worthwhile that I can ever do here now on the BBC. I think those of us of a certain generation, the sort of idea of the Yeti was formed as boys by Tintin in Tibet and Elshe, and I'd like your own assessment, because it was quite a sympathetic portrayal of the Yeti. It was an attempt to sort of portray it as sort of, as a very, genuinely sort of decent kind of creature that wanted to help. How much has that depiction influenced the imagery of the Yeti and the sort of general public feelings about it?
I think there's been a mix over the years of this being a fearsome creature, to be feared, and then that movie we had the poster of, Abominable Snowman, there it's depicted as, it's actually the poor Yeti that's being hunted by humans. And in the Pixar, the Disney ones, in one of them, I think both of them, they're portrayed now as quite sympathetic rather than aggressive, right?
And I think that represents the sort of dichotomy in humans' interaction with the wild world, right? We both kind of respect it and admire it, but we also want to tame it. We also want to shoot creatures. I think those aspects of how we interact with wilderness are within us always.
And there's a whole thing here about the role of monsters. I mean, the Yeti is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, you get into the history of looking for it, that's fascinating, the CIA stuff, whatever. You get into human psychology, you get into Buddhism and monkey mind, and we found it being used as both a kind of social, let's say a good social mechanism. If you're a bad child, it's the Yeti that will come and get you. We also, heard murders and other crimes blamed on the Yeti, so that was like this genre of it was the Yeti what done it kind of thing. So it's, it is, and that's the role of monsters in many societies as well, and a way of facing up to dark aspects of your subconscious. So lots of stuff.
And I think on a broader level, we have to ask ourselves, why are humans across the world so fascinated with the wild man motif, right? This isn't just the Yeti in the Himalayas. You go to almost any culture anywhere in the world, and there's this kind of idea of the wild man and the person who lives in the forest and is almost human. And that seems to perform some sort of psychological function for us, quite separate to whether there is a creature that is behind these stories that's currently living or that once lived and that we have a human memory of.
Well, I was still surprised because we'd heard about Bigfoot, of course, we've heard about the Yowie in Australia, but there's an article coming out in Singapore Expat Living on us, so we've hit the big time now, and they told us there is actually a rumoured bipedal beast in some park in Singapore. I mean, that's probably pushing it, even for me.
So you don't need a lot of wilderness for these things to live.
This whole idea of people being taken in by false evidence. Edmund Hillary goes around the world with a piece of goat. What did he think he was doing? Did he ever realise it was a piece of goat?
Yeah, he did.
He did.
Yeah, I mean, you know the story better than I do, but
he saw it. They went and got it tested in, I think, London, Paris, and Chicago, and it came back as it was Siro. I mean, it was in. That's the same scalp you see in the picture. It's in the monastery there. There's also an alleged hand in a monastery right up near Everest, which we know the provenance of. It was made by the team, they're called Weta Productions. They're in New Zealand, and they do the props for Lord of the Rings. And that monastery is still claiming it's a Yeti hand, but what happened was they had an old Yeti hand. It was stolen.
It wasn't really a Yeti hand, but...
Well, they had a hand. And a New Zealand pilot thought it was very sad because they had this Yeti hand, now it was gone, so he had one made up by the guys who do the Lord of the Rings props. So, yeah, I mean...
The original one was stolen as a trophy and also tested and came back human, I think, right?
It was smuggled out by Jimmy Stewart, the actor Jimmy Stewart. Amazing story around this. Hollywood actor Jimmy Stewart, from Calcutta to London in his wife's lingerie case because they thought a British customs officer would never check inside a lady's lingerie case, and indeed they did not. So.
Yeah. It's the gift that keeps on giving.
We could go on all night.
Yeah. Just anybody who wants to ask a question, just go and stand there and I'll bring you in.
Thank you, guys. Marshall is my name and I'm a club member. In a past life, I was a wildlife biologist from Australia, Thredbo National Park, down there. One of the things that we used to do when we went into a new site was to profile the biology. And the easiest way to get a handle on the animals there was to look around at droppings. Now, there's a very notable Australian book called What Scat Is That? Now, scat are the poo, the droppings, right? Wombats have a poo that is cube-shaped, right? So that's extremely easy to know that it's a wombat. It's an eastern type of wombat. You pick up another piece of scat, and what we used to do was pick up the scat and break it open and smell it. So you could easily tell, that's an eastern grey. Or wallaby, brown, juvenile male. Right? So in your trips, did you ever spend time trying to hunt down the scat of this animal or being? And if not, would that be something that you could do on your future expeditions?
Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, we did, everywhere we went, ask people if they had any evidence, and we specifically talked about hair and scat and bone. We talked to a number of members of the Royal Yeti searching expedition in Bhutan who had worked for the king. The fourth king had been very interested in the Yeti. He had teams of, I think, probably 100 or more people across the country who were tasked with chasing down all of the stories that came up and trying to find out what was behind them, making plaster casts of prints and collecting DNA evidence or collecting samples that could be tested. And it was all sent back to the palace, and no one really knows what happened to it after that. There's kind of a palace wall, and then you can't find out where all this went. They didn't really have the ability to call up the fourth king and say, hey, that thing I sent you last week, what gives? So that
when I said let's get a ladder and go to the palace, you were like, no way.
Veto.
But it's going to get easier because environmental DNA analysis, there was an article out last week, you can basically now swab a leaf and you can get the DNA of everything that's come in contact with it. So, I mean, with these kind of techniques, I think pretty soon you're going to find out if there is something, right?
Yeah.
Question?
Hi, good evening. My name's Derek. I'm also a club member and concerned citizen. Thank you very much for your...
About our mental health? Or
Thank you for your presentation. My question is about the role of maybe a religious... Is there any religious aspect, or is there an element of spirituality to this animal, and how might that relate to other mythical creatures like the like Ogopogo or the Loch Ness Monster and the like? Is it something that people need to have, or Is there more to it along those lines? Thank you.
Yeah, there's a range of roles. I mean, you see it depicted in monastery, temple artwork. The Brokpa people of the far east of Bhutan, their origin story is that friendly, or yet they weren't friendly yetis, right? They were unfriendly yetis that were tamed by Aum Jomo, their patron saint, and then kind of helped transport them safely from Tibet into Bhutan, where they settled. And so now, the Yeti has a prominent role for them, right? So it does come up, yeah.
And I think religious role, you hear very different things from different religious communities, all, Mahayana Buddhist, but some will say, yes, there's, Yetis bring food to monks meditating in caves, or yes, the Yeti has a spiritual role, as we saw from the temple art. Others will say, no, there's nothing related between the Yeti and the religion. This is something completely separate. So you hear very different stories.
And I mean, it's part of a whole panoply of monsters that you get in Tibetan Buddhism, which comes from the origins in the Bon religion, which preceded it, right? Where you have you have monsters and demons in every pass, representing every kind of mental state, representing your inner demons. So it's
and the Yeti is definitely not the weirdest of those monsters. So yeah. I mean, in fact, we also heard of a particular monk in Arunachal Pradesh who could write scrolls, or there scrolls existed. He had scrolls telling you what to do if you were troubled by Yetis, and this would give the kind of recipe for building the monument or incanting certain words, ways to protect yourself from Yeti harassment. So there is something there in some of the traditions. Yeah.
Did you want to ask a question?
Really interesting, thank you. My question is, out of all those places and countries that you visited, was there one in particular where the belief and the sightings were stronger than others? Thanks.
I think the more remote you got anywhere, the more the sightings and experiences were real rather than sort of mythological. So you'd go near to the wilderness and people would be talking about these creatures in very kind of magical terms. And the deeper you'd get into the forest and the more that you would talk to hunters and people who lived in really remote areas, they would then be talking about it as a matter of fact, thing that lives there and that they experience. I mean, I always remember growing up in southwest England, we had the Beast of Bodmin, and there would be sightings of black panthers around, and black panthers definitely don't live in southwest England, although I do think one was caught after escaping from a wildlife park. So, you hear on the news that this creature has escaped, and suddenly every little rustle and shadow becomes that creature, right? So you have to allow for the fact that there are stories of the Yeti everywhere, which means that when people see things they don't quite know how to pin down, it's the Yeti that comes to mind, and then when they describe it, it's more Yeti-like than panther-like, say. But that's not all of them. That doesn't explain many of the stories that we heard that were, close range, clearly seen hunters, people who knew about creatures. So I think there's a lot going on here, and unpacking it is quite complicated. And I thought it was going to be easy. You'd just be able to dismiss all this and go home and say, clearly nothing there. I'm not sure I believe there's a Yeti out there, but there is, a lot of experiences we had that are difficult to just dismiss out of hand. You need a more complicated answer to that, maybe.
The areas that you've shown are incredibly remote. In terms of telecommunications, is there anything there? Are there any telecom towers? Is there?
I think it's definitely getting better across the region now, right? That you can often pick up a signal, but the more remote you get, the more difficult it gets. So.
I mean, the reason I ask is that you have the arrival of the smartphone immediately. Yeah. And in Burma in particular, we all know that they have these incredibly cheap smartphones, and the whole impact in the space of 5 years of the telecoms coming in was staggering. I mean, it introduced Facebook and a whole host of problems related to that. But of course, if you get smartphones in and there is something wandering around, then you're more likely to get a picture.
It depends a lot on the topography, right? If you've got mountains and not very forested valleys, then you just put one tower on the mountain and you reach the entire valley. Yeah. When you have sort of flat forest, that's really hard to cover.
In say, northern Thailand, the Karen, who have elephants, have smartphones and they know where to go in the hills. Yeah. to communicate to get the vets in to help the elephants.
Yeah.
So the point is they carry the phone, which has the camera on board.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder why in the Americas we haven't seen more pictures of Bigfoot and Sasquatch and what have you. I mean, if they're there, we have pictures of Concorde taking off and it's on fire. Somebody happened to be taking a picture at the time. Almost nothing happens in the modern world that's not now photographed. It's incredible.
Yeah.
But
That's a good point.
It could be something in store.
Yeah, they're definitely getting more common, but there's also some yak herders we met in Arunachal that they would have a phone, but they'll kind of leave it in the village and then go off for some days and come back because there's hardly any reception up there. You know, we have, I mean, there's a lot more stories even than are in the podcast, and we've been sent, we've seen videos, you know, strange blurry creatures we can't really explain, but, you know, you make a decision of whether to really include that, you know, because you just don't really know. It's come from some remote village, you can't really see it. Could it be something? But you're right, I mean, surely in time, with smartphones, with eDNA, you know, we should be able to find out if there is something there. Whether that's a good thing, I mean, increasingly, you know, we were getting of the mindset of, are we doing the right thing? Because what would actually happen if, you know, there is evidence there's something out there? What would happen to these communities? What would happen to the Sakteng Wildlife Reserve in eastern Bhutan when, you know, Jonathan and all his buddies go out there to film it? Yeah, nightmare.
Right, question.
Yes, Peter Metcalf, member of the club. You mentioned sort of in passing the question of what the Yeti might or might not eat. And I wondered what the local people's stories are about what they eat. And as a kind of supplement to that, do they fear that they will carry off their cattle or their yaks or whatever? I've just been in Ladakh with some people who are working with the Snow Leopard Trust. And their main, I mean, one of the big sources of information is stories from local people who say, oh, a calf was taken last week or something else. Anyway, just a question.
Yeah, the diet thing is a big one, right? If it's an ape, then it should be eating some bamboo or some kind of vegetation, but we hear often about yaks being attacked and killed. That 74 attack in Nepal, the lady we tracked down, Lakpadoma Sherpa, yaks killed and apparently eaten. In Mustang, I was told by a nomad that, or by the interpreter who was with me, that the Yeti was eating marmite. It turned out he'd said marmots, but I was there going, well, that's marmite? I really wasn't expecting that, but marmots apparently. Yeah.
These are the fluffy ground living kind of things. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Looking at this footage, as you were pointing out, there's no snow in a lot of it. But I was thinking about polar bears and the fact that they exist in very remote climates. And one of the things that polar bears do is scavenge. So they come out, if there's trash around, they're like grizzlies, they'll go for it and disturb it. So what's rather striking about your Yeti, if he exists, is that he's quite averse to being seen. He clearly avoids humans and stays away.
Yeah.
Well, he identifies as they, by the way. But there are stories in the past of Yeti-human conflict, Yetis going into villages, trying to get food, etc., and that the humans really push them out, and now they stay well back. So it seems that was a thing. I mean, people told us before the road came in, and when they say the road, they mean the one that's 50 kilometers away. There were lots more sightings. If you read this, they're 10 a penny in the 50s. But yeah, it seems that they're if they're still out there, I would say they're in a couple of remote valleys somewhere and are very traumatized about any contact with people like us.
Question.
Good evening. My name's Steve. I'd like to really congratulate you on the fantastic report. My question regards the logistics of your trip. I seem to understand that there are only the two of you during the whole trip, but is this true? I mean, because you would have had to communicate with these locals, or find your way, for example, to find the man on his this yak man in the mountains. without a guide. How was it possible to communicate and find this yak man in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah, so this was 4 separate trips. We didn't have a big team with us, but we did work with local people as fixers and guides to find stories, to take us to places and so on. But we didn't have a permanent kind of team with us on those different trips. So in Burma, it was just the two of us driving up. I speak Burmese. We worked with a local Lisu person who sort of gave us an intro into that community. Very little assistance on that one. In Bhutan, it was a bit more heavy duty. There was a requirement that we had a guide with us at all times from the government. And that guide was brilliant and extremely helpful. And we'd also put the word out ahead in Sakteng that we were interested to go to certain places. The guide knew the area well. We met his brother actually there, who was a village headman, and took us around and showed us. So yeah, we definitely relied on a lot of local knowledge, but we didn't have a big team permanently traveling with us.
And then in Nepal, because you weren't there, I hired a cameraman and a helicopter. And yeah.
We're all very concerned about climate change and the effect that it has, particularly in Burma at the moment, where there's clear evidence that it's affecting the crops in the central region. Is there anything to suggest that the environment is changing in the areas where these creatures might live, and what might be the consequences of that?
I mean, clearly, right? When you
Questions
go,
you weren't expecting.
When you go to any high mountain environment, I mean, immediately you hear about retreating glaciers, more floods, rainfall that is much. That is the story of the Alps. It's the story of the Himalayas.
Right.
It's happening. Linking that to the Yeti, I'm not sure we heard anything along those lines. I think what we did hear was that the encroachment of modernity was very much linked to what people said was a reduction in sightings, because, well, either it's driving the Yeti into the deeper parts of the forest, or modernity comes with a rejection of traditional beliefs and stories and accounts which make people less likely to attribute experiences to a mythical or non kind of mainstream creature. I don't know.
Good. Well, are there any more questions? You're exhausted. I was going to ask our what's it called? Scat,
Yes.
scat expert about what they eat. Oh, he's back. Would you be able to tell from scat what a Yeti has eaten if you found? It's a bit like Australian wine tasting, isn't it?
Yes, it is. No, it is quite a tried and true technique to actually lift and smell and break the scat. And koalas, huge amount of eucalyptus oil. And you can say that's a type of koala. So Yetis, I'd say you should be able to pick something up somewhere. I really urge you, next trip, have a good go at trying to find scat.
Get into it.
Oh, and if you wanted to think about what it might look like, well, you've already spoken about meat, carnivores. That would have an odour of a certain acid type, and vegetation. Well, you'd be able to look through it and for fibres. It's like cow manure, which is fibre. So yeah, go for it.
Well,
Yeti Scat, it would be a great book to write.
Ugly food, sorry.
You could have Eastern Scat, Western Yeti Scat.
You can have scat night at the club. Yeah, it's something to look forward to, I think. Are you going to ask a question? Or?
I was going to quickly ask.
Yeah, sure.
Wouldn't the sort of lack of dead Yetis be the most compelling evidence that there aren't any? I'm just.
Where's the body?
Is there any sort of explanation before that?
So
that
there's
people
one
have
thing
come up with?
that a lot of local people will say, you know, we don't want to touch this thing. It's, you know, 'cause we would ask exactly that same question, right? We're not up there, especially with Richard, that's the first thing that gets asked. We heard of people who'd, oh yeah, I found a bone and I threw it away, or no, we don't like to touch this stuff. It's, you know, it's a bad omen.
One person said that
Yeah.
Yetis disappear, Yeti bodies disappear if you don't do special things to them.
So that makes it especially difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's, different
So yeah, I
stories.
have the same question. I mean, what do they eat? Where's the breeding population? Why haven't we seen a dead one? If not a live one, why not a dead one?
Yeah, there's other creatures, again, like these, there was the antelope or the ox
Yeah.
in Cambodia that they found, you know, and it was like, well, they'd heard stories about it, can't possibly exist, no one's got any bone, why not? And then finally, bang, it pops up a few
And
years
you don't,
ago, so-
to be fair, you don't find a lot of dead snow leopards littering the environment either. So I think in these kind of environments where there's one human per, you know, however many hundreds of square kilometers it is, where there's one path through that landscape and every other valley is just unreachable, if it lives beyond human existence, the body isn't just going to turn up. But surely once one would fall into a river and be washed downstream. I don't know. Yeah. But there we go.
Well, I mean, you've got thousands of monkeys in Chonburi province, incredible numbers, and you very, very rarely see a dead monkey. I mean, it's just extraordinary. So you wonder what happens to them. Obviously, there's a lot of bacteria and forest activity that plunders them, but you just don't see many corpses. And that's a far less remote area, obviously, Chonburi. Right, have we run our course? Well, I'd like to thank Richard and Andrew for a really delightful evening. I mean, it was tremendous fun. There's more ahead, so you're not done yet. And I think we'd like to have you back when you do that again, and we'll get more people, because the word will spread from this. This is a really fascinating subject. So congratulations, very enterprising, and your credibility is intact. I'll quote you ad nauseam.
Thanks, Don.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.